She was just the quiet waitress at the corner diner, always on time, sleeves rolled low, never speaking of the limp or the scar on her wrist. But when a young soldier walked in and recognized her face from a combat photo in his training manual, everything changed. The truth of who she once was and the lives she saved could no longer stay hidden. If you believe quiet heroes deserve to be seen, type "respect" in the comments. The bell above the door chimed with a soft, familiar jingle, letting in a gust of cold air and the scent of snow still clinging to the boots of early morning patrons. Linda Mayfield glanced up just briefly as she wiped down the end of the counter. Same faces, mostly. Ranchers, linemen, and retirees already on their second cup of coffee before the sun crested the mountains. She moved with practiced ease, refilling mugs, sliding plates of bacon and eggs onto tables without ceremony. Her gait bore the faintest irregularity, a subtle limp smoothed out by years of compensating, the way dancers or soldiers learn to mask pain through repetition. No one asked about it. She wore her hair in a no-nonsense ponytail tucked beneath a simple navy ball cap. Her uniform was always spotless, apron tied just so, sleeves buttoned down to the wrist no matter the heat from the grill. Linda was kind in a way that kept people at ease, but at a distance, efficient, warm enough to feel like comfort, but never familiar enough to invite questions. The kind of waitress who remembered your coffee order, but not your birthday, and you never thought to notice. In this sleepy corner of Colorado, the Summit View Diner had been a staple for over 30 years. It sat at the edge of a highway that wound through timber and cattle land, halfway between forgotten towns and memories best left buried. Truckers came through sometimes, passing through on their way to Denver or Cheyenne, but most of the booths were filled with locals. Men who spoke in short phrases, women who asked for extra cream, all of them trusting the routine of eggs over easy and hash browns browned just right. Linda fit the place like a missing puzzle piece that had been there all along. She didn't talk much, but when she did, it was always gentle. "How's that wrist, Hank?" Or, "Pie's fresh today, Mrs. Carter." Never more than was needed. No one knew she lived in the small unit above the hardware store across the street. No one knew that every year, on April 6th, she called in sick and walked 2 hours to a tiny veteran cemetery outside of Rifle. She said little about herself, and no one pressed. It was easier that way. She carried herself like someone with a past she didn't want to revisit, and the town, too polite or too distracted, let her keep it hidden. Just another waitress with tired eyes and steady hands. That's how she wanted it. The lunch rush came and went like clockwork. Trucks idling outside in the gravel lot, chairs scraping linoleum, and the smell of grilled onions lingering long after the last burger had been served. Linda moved through it all like a shadow stitched into the seams of the place, always there, always in motion. Just eggs and coffee. She'd joke with a slight smile when asked how the day was going, like that was all she ever needed or wanted from life. Her regulars knew her name, of course. They'd nod a greeting, say, "Hey, Linda," as they slid into booths worn smooth by time. She greeted them all the same, by order, not by biography. "Your usual, Cal? Toast with strawberry, right, Mrs. Green?" It was a language of repetition, of silent rituals that filled the gaps people didn't know how to speak into. But beyond the menu, Linda remained a mystery. She never talked about her weekend, never mentioned family, never shared photos of kids or grandkids, though she looked like someone who might have had both. She wore long sleeves every day, no matter the weather. Flannel in the winter, cotton in the summer. When July heat poured through the windows and made the air hum, she rolled up her cuffs no higher than her forearms, always careful, always measured. A faded burn scar curled around the edge of her right wrist like an old story she had no interest in telling. If anyone noticed, they didn't ask, and Linda never offered. The old wall clock above the pie case ticked toward 3 o'clock p.m. Without fail, Linda would untie her apron, place it neatly on the hook in the back room, and walk out with a thermos of leftover coffee and the same well-worn canvas tote slung over her shoulder. Never 3:05. Never early. Always on time. Routine wasn't just comfort for Linda, it was armor. "See you tomorrow," she'd say to Mr. Harper, the diner's owner, her tone neutral but respectful. He'd nod, not expecting more. "Thanks, Linda." Outside, the light always hit the window in the same soft angle, painting gold across the booths where she had just stood. The world went on, and Linda vanished into it, as if she had never been there at all. Just eggs and coffee. That was all she left behind. The door opened with its familiar jingle, but Linda didn't look up right away. She was wiping down the counter, listening absently to the low hum of the old jukebox playing a tune from 20 years ago. It wasn't until the boots stepped fully inside, mud dried in the treads, movement just a touch too precise, that she lifted her gaze. He was young, 22 maybe. His uniform was crisp, newly issued. The camouflage still had its stiffness, the name patch on his chest reading "Moore" in neat black letters. He hesitated at the entrance the way first-timers often did, eyes scanning the layout like he'd done it before in a dozen different mess halls and roadside diners. Then he moved to the counter, pulling out a stool with the careful, quiet grace of someone taught not to draw attention. "Just coffee," he said, his voice polite, maybe a little unsure. "Black." Linda nodded once. Her hands didn't tremble as she reached for the pot, didn't falter as she poured. But something in her face, not quite a flinch, more like a pause held somewhere deep behind the eyes, betrayed a moment of recognition. Not of him, but of what he represented. Boots, uniform, that particular scent of canvas and purpose. She'd spent years trying to separate herself from those things. She slid the mug across the counter, her voice even. "You stationed at the base?" "Yes, ma'am," he said automatically, then winced slightly. "Sorry, just habit." "Don't worry about it," she replied, already moving toward the stack of clean plates. Her tone made it clear. Conversation optional, answers not required. He sipped the coffee, eyes drifting around the diner. Photos of mountain landscapes lined the walls, a display of antique syrup bottles near the register, a community board with flyers for lost dogs and church breakfasts. It all felt safe. Familiar in that way small towns sometimes were, even when you'd never set foot in them before. "You've been here a while?" he asked, more to fill the silence than anything else. Linda glanced up. "A few years." "Nice spot," he offered. "Reminds me of home." That earned the faintest smile. "Where's home?" "Boise, Idaho." She nodded and returned to her work. There was nothing remarkable about the exchange. Just a soldier and a waitress, coffee between them. Silence shared like a blanket on a cold day. But when Linda walked past him a second time, he noticed the limp. Barely there, but real. And when she returned to the counter, she took a longer moment than usual to smooth her sleeve down to her wrist. The coffee pot was still warm when Linda returned to the counter, steam curling from the spout in lazy ribbons as she refilled cups without ceremony. Ethan sat where he had before, one hand wrapped around the mug, the other idly turning a sugar packet over between his fingers. He wasn't in a hurry. Soldiers rarely were when they had a pocket of peace, however temporary. The diner offered that in its own way, a place where the world felt slower, less jagged around the edges. He thanked her quietly as she leaned forward to top off his cup, and that's when he saw it. The fabric of her sleeve tugged upward as she poured, just an inch or two, no more than a sliver of skin exposed between cuff and wrist. But it was enough. A burn scar, pale and old, curved across the underside of her forearm. Not from a kitchen accident, not a grease pop or a careless brush with the stove. Ethan had seen scars like that before. On Marines who came back from roadside blasts. On medics who dragged others out of fire. He didn't react, didn't speak, but his grip on the mug tightened just slightly. Linda noticed the shift in his posture. Not the stare, he was careful about that, but the stillness that followed. She pulled her sleeve down with a casual motion, not rushed, but practiced, as if she'd done it 100 times before, as if she always expected someone to notice eventually. She gave a half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Coffee's on the house for servicemen," she said softly, then turned to refill another table without waiting for a reply. Ethan stared into the dark liquid in front of him. Something was stirring now. A memory he couldn't place. A name he couldn't quite remember. But that scar, it anchored a thought. A flash of a face from a grainy briefing photo. Not here. Not this place. And yet, he didn't ask. Not yet. Linda moved through the diner as she always did. Efficient, kind, invisible when she wanted to be. But there was a shadow trailing behind her now. One Ethan could see. A story folded into the way she walked. The way her eyes never lingered too long on anything. He wondered how long she'd been hiding in plain sight. How long the world had passed her by, not knowing the weight she carried beneath flannel and silence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows gently. Inside, neither of them spoke. But something had shifted. Something had been seen. The barracks were quiet, the kind of stillness that only settles in places filled with routine and fatigue. Fluorescent light bled through the slats of the blinds, casting faint lines across Ethan's bunk. He lay on his back, arms behind his head, eyes tracing the ceiling as if it might offer answers. Sleep came slow that night, stubborn and tangled. His mind kept returning to the diner, to the woman behind the counter, to Linda. It wasn't her name that stuck with him. It was her eyes. The way they narrowed slightly before a smile. The way they scanned the room without ever really landing anywhere for too long. Watchful, but distant. And the scar. That pale curl of skin that vanished beneath her sleeve like it had something to hide. He'd seen a face like hers before, but not in real life. In a photo. Months ago, during a field briefing for combat medical response. A story buried in the middle of a slideshow. A woman in a dust-covered uniform, crouched in the sand beside a downed Humvee, cradling a wounded Marine. Blood on her hands. Determination in her eyes. There had been something haunting about that image. Something unforgettable. He remembered asking afterward, almost offhand, who was she? Staff Sergeant Mayfield, the instructor had said. Retired early, wounded in the line, took shrapnel and burns dragging 3 men out of a blown convoy. Never gave a press interview, just vanished after discharge. At the time, Ethan had thought of her as one of those ghosts the military never quite lets go of. The ones who disappear between headlines. The ones who didn't want medals or speeches, just silence. A quiet place to land. Now, hours after his second visit to the diner, that same face hovered in the back of his mind. The resemblance wasn't perfect. The photo had been grainy, sun-washed, but the eyes... He would bet anything on those eyes. He sat up slowly, his bunk creaking under his weight. In the footlocker beneath him was a binder filled with old printouts and briefing sheets, stuff most guys tossed after training. But Ethan kept things. He flipped through the pages, searching, heart ticking just a little faster, and there it was. Page 23. Operation Halberd, 2012. A woman kneeling beside a burning vehicle, uniform torn, face smeared with ash and blood, but unmistakably her. Staff Sergeant L. Mayfield, Linda, the waitress at the Summit View Diner. He stared at the photo for a long time, then set it on his bunk and exhaled, the truth settling in like a stone dropped into still water. She had saved lives. Once. Now she just served coffee. The morning light filtered in through the wide front windows of the diner, catching on the chrome napkin holders and the streak-free shine of the coffee pots. Outside, frost clung stubbornly to the edges of windshields, the town just beginning to stir. Inside, it was already warm, grill sizzling, radio murmuring some forgotten country tune, and Linda Mayfield at her usual post by the prep counter. She wrapped silverware with the same quiet concentration she brought to every task. Fork, knife, spoon, fold, tuck, roll. Her fingers moved with a muscle memory that didn't belong to the rhythm of diners and breakfast rushes. Her hands were steady, deliberate, like someone used to checking gear in the dark, like someone trained to keep order in chaos. The rolled napkins formed neat rows in a plastic bin, each one identical to the last. No loose ends, no wrinkles. She hummed as she worked, not a song most would recognize, but a cadence softened by time. A marine call turned lullaby, its once brisk tempo slowed into something almost tender. Barely more than breath. I don't know, but I've been told. The words never made it past her lips, but the tune held shape in her throat. Across the room, the kitchen clattered with the predictable noise of prep. Eggs cracked, bacon hissed, and the cook, Marty, barked out the occasional request for another batch of potatoes. Linda moved between tasks like clockwork, resetting tables, checking the percolators, refreshing the creamers. Every motion, small and precise. She never wasted steps. A customer waved for more coffee, and she glided over, filled the cup without spilling a drop. "Here you go, hun," she said with that same practiced warmth. Not too friendly, not too distant, just enough to make a stranger feel welcome without ever inviting them in too close. The regulars knew better than to ask questions. She kept to herself, but she worked like someone who had been through fire, and come out the other side trying not to be noticed. There was something in the way she stood too, spine straight, even when she was tired, as if slouching might give something away. By 10 o'clock a.m., the breakfast crowd had thinned. Linda returned to her silverware, folding another roll with care. The bin was almost full now, and still she kept wrapping, as if order alone could keep the rest of the world from falling apart. Outside, the sun had risen high enough to melt the frost. Inside, the tune in Linda's throat faded into silence, but her hands never stopped moving. The locker hinges creaked in protest as Ethan pulled it open, the fluorescent light above flickering once before settling into its usual hum. Around him, the barracks were quiet, most of the others already out on drills or heading to the chow hall. He crouched low, rummaging past spare uniforms, a worn pair of running shoes, and a tin of protein powder no one ever actually used. His hands moved faster now, a kind of urgency threading through his fingers. He knew he had it, tucked somewhere in the back of a binder he never threw out, the one labeled Case Studies in black Sharpie across the spine. Most of the guys tossed their training materials after each rotation. Ethan didn't. Not because he was sentimental, but because something about those stories, the ones they told in dark classrooms with click-through PowerPoints and low voices, felt too real to forget. Especially the ones with no ending. He flipped the binder open on his bunk, skimming past diagrams of triage kits and battlefield evacuation flowcharts. Then he saw it. Page 23. There she was. The photo wasn't high resolution, just a printed frame frozen mid-chaos. Smoke curling in the background, sand turned dark with blood, a Humvee behind her burning at the wheel well, and in the center of it all, a woman in combat gear, kneeling on one knee, cradling a Marine half her size with one arm, while signaling toward an unseen medic with the other. Her face was streaked with soot, hair damp with sweat under her helmet. But her expression was clear, sharp, focused, impossibly calm. Ethan stared at her, not just at the way she held the wounded man, but at her eyes. Steady, pale, and unmistakably the same ones that had watched him over the rim of a coffee pot just 2 days ago. He leaned closer, eyes scanning the edges of the photo. Her name tag was blurred by dust, but in the caption below, it was printed plain as day. Staff Sergeant Linda Mayfield, 2nd Marine Logistics Group, Operation Halberd, 2012. Ethan exhaled slowly, like the truth was something heavier than air. Same name, same scar, same eyes. The waitress folding napkins in a sleepy Colorado diner had once pulled men from fire. He ran his finger along the edge of the image, like the act of tracing it might somehow explain the why of it all, why she'd walked away from recognition, from rank, from the stories others told in her place. She hadn't just disappeared. She'd chosen to. The next morning, the diner looked the same. It always did. Sunlight filtering through smudged windows, the low hum of country music, the soft hiss of the griddle just behind the pass-through window. A bell above the door jingled as Ethan stepped inside, boots knocking softly against the worn linoleum. He nodded to the cook behind the counter, gave a polite smile to the elderly couple in the corner booth. But his eyes were already searching. She was at the far end wrapping napkins again, always wrapping napkins. Linda didn't look up until he was nearly at the counter. She didn't smile this time, didn't greet him like she had the day before. Just poured the coffee quietly, placed it in front of him and waited. Not unfriendly, just measured, like someone waiting to see which direction a breeze might blow. He cleared his throat. "I was thinking about yesterday," he said. "You look familiar." A slight tension crept into her shoulders, barely there but visible if you knew what to watch for. She didn't stop what she was doing, but the rhythm of her hands slowed. "Not from around here," she said. "No, ma'am," Ethan replied carefully. "But I did a lot of training back at Pendleton. We had a briefing once, combat medevac, Operation Halberd. There was a photo, a woman pulling a Marine out of a fire." He saw it then, the way her jaw tensed, the way her gaze flicked toward the kitchen door like she was calculating escape. She said nothing. He leaned forward, softer now. "Did you ever serve?" The silence stretched for a heartbeat too long. Linda froze mid-fold, her fingers wrapped around a spoon like it might ground her. Her eyes darkened, not with fear, but with something older, wearier. "You got the wrong person," she said quietly. The words were crisp, not defensive, not angry, just final. Then she turned, placed the half-wrapped napkin into the bin, and walked toward the back, apron swaying gently with each step. Ethan watched her go, unsure whether to follow or let her be. He stayed seated, staring down into the swirl of his coffee. It was bitter. Too bitter, he didn't touch it. In the distance, the kitchen door swung shut with a soft creak, and that was the end of it. Or at least it should have been. The gym on base was half empty when Ethan found Sergeant Willis, wiping down a barbell with a rag that had seen better days. The sergeant moved with the worn grace of a man who'd carried too many packs, led too many long marches, and learned too many lessons the hard way. He didn't talk much unless it mattered, which was why Ethan had waited. Waited until the moment felt right, or at least close enough. "Sergeant," Ethan began, leaning on the bench press frame beside him, "can I ask you something kind of off the record?" Willis raised an eyebrow but didn't stop moving. "If it's about that shoulder press machine, I already told you, it's not rigged, you're just weak." Ethan smirked, but only for a second. "No, not that. It's about a name. Someone I think I saw." That got his attention. The sergeant tossed the rag over his shoulder and folded his arms, waiting. "I've been going to this diner in town," Ethan said. "There's a woman who works there. Older, maybe late 40s, limp, scar on her wrist, real quiet, but I recognized her from a training photo." Willis squinted, the kind of squint that came from years of sorting truth from stories. "What photo?" "Operation Halberd," Ethan said. "Staff Sergeant Linda Mayfield, the one who pulled 6 men out of a burning convoy after the IED hit. She's in the photo holding a wounded Marine, face covered in ash, uniform torn up." Willis blinked slowly, as if the name had reached a room inside his mind he hadn't opened in years. "Mayfield," he repeated. "Jesus." Ethan leaned in. "So, it was her?" Willis sat down on the bench like his knees had lost patience. "That woman," he started, then paused. "She didn't just pull those men out. She went back 3 times, under fire. 2 of them were already unconscious. She took shrapnel in the leg and kept moving. Last guy she pulled out was her CO." Ethan swallowed. "And then?" "Discharged 6 months later," Willis said. "Could have had a desk job, commendation ceremony, book deal. Hell, they tried. But she didn't want it. Said the real heroes were the ones who didn't make it back. Packed up and disappeared. No one heard from her again." Until now, Ethan thought. Willis looked at him, a bit softer now. "She's working at a diner?" Ethan nodded. Willis shook his head, more to himself than anyone. "Some people carry their service like medals, others carry it like a shadow." And in that quiet moment, Ethan understood. He hadn't just stumbled across a waitress with a past. He'd found the missing chapter in a story the military had long stopped telling. The clatter of pans and hiss of bacon on the flat top couldn't quite cover the whispers that had started to weave through the kitchen like steam. It began with a question, soft, uncertain, but enough to spark. "Did you hear what the soldier said?" It was Marty, the cook, who'd first overheard Ethan's voice the day before. Not all of it, just enough. Something about a photo, a scar, a name spoken like a revelation. He didn't say anything at the time, just kept flipping pancakes like it was any other day. But the next morning he repeated it to Tasha, the new girl on morning prep. By lunchtime it had made its way around the whole back line. They didn't say Linda's name out loud, not at first, but everyone knew who they meant. "She's way too precise. You ever notice that?" Tasha said, while restocking the fridge. "Like military-grade tidy. Maybe she was a sniper or something." "Nah," Marty chimed in, half laughing. "CIA, more like. Quiet types always are. Probably got a whole second life we don't know about. Fake name, fake past, the whole thing." He meant it as a joke, mostly. But the way he looked toward the dining room windows told another story. Curiosity laced with unease. "She does have that scar," someone added from the dish pit. "Big one, on her wrist. You ever ask her about it?" No one had. No one dared. Linda moved through the space like she always did, efficient, focused, eyes ahead. But that day, the air behind her shifted just enough to notice. Conversations hushed when she passed. Glances lingered too long. Even Marty, usually loose with sarcasm, toned it down when handing her orders. She felt it, that undercurrent, like a wind changing direction before a storm. At one point, she reached for a clean plate and noticed two of the servers watching her from the prep counter. They looked away too fast, pretended to be interested in their order tickets. Linda didn't say a word. Just went back to folding napkins with a precision that didn't belong in a small-town diner. The same way she'd folded field dressings once, far from here, with lives hanging in the balance. She wasn't surprised. Rumors always found their way through cracks, and she'd built her whole world on staying just ahead of them. But now, the cracks were showing. The diner closed late that night. One of the dishwashers had called in sick, so Linda stayed behind to help, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water long after the last customer had left. The clatter of dishes had long since quieted, replaced by the distant hum of the freezer fan and the occasional creak of the old building settling into itself. When she finally untied her apron and slipped on her coat, the sky outside was already ink-dark, the air sharp with late winter frost. She walked the same route home she always did, down the narrow sidewalk past shuttered storefronts, where the only light came from the glow of a few flickering lampposts and the yellowed windows of the laundromat. Her boots scuffed along the concrete, quiet steps that matched the rhythm of her breath. She could have taken the quicker way, through the back alley behind the hardware store, but she didn't. Not tonight. Instead, she made the turn toward the town hall. The memorial wall stood in the courtyard beside it. 30 feet of smooth, dark stone, etched with names that no one ever quite forgot, even if they rarely said them aloud. It was simple, unadorned, just a slab of permanence in a town where everything else felt temporary. Linda stopped a few feet away, hands in her coat pockets. Her eyes moved over the rows with practiced familiarity, the names like landmarks in her memory. Some she'd served with, others she'd only heard about in passing. A few had died before she'd ever enlisted. And then there was one, Corporal David Ruiz. She lingered there, her breath curling in the cold. The name was etched in the center panel, clean and precise. No rank, no story, just a name and a year. She hadn't spoken it in a long time. He'd been younger than her, smart, reckless in a way that made him good at war and terrible at peace. He'd made everyone laugh, even in the worst of it. She'd pulled him out once, dragged him out of a blast radius with her arm half burned and her leg full of shrapnel. But the second time, she hadn't been fast enough. She stared at his name like it still owed her something, or maybe like she owed it. The wind picked up, rustling the flag overhead, and Linda exhaled slowly. Then, without a word, she turned and kept walking, her steps quieter now. The diner, the whispers, the scar, they were noise. But this was the part she never escaped. The lock on her apartment door stuck a little, the way it always did when the temperature dropped. Linda jiggled the key, pressed her shoulder against the wood, and stepped into the quiet. The space was small, just one room and a narrow bathroom off to the side, but it was clean, orderly, every object in its place. A twin bed tucked against the far wall, a worn recliner by the window, a bookshelf filled with second-hand paperbacks sorted by author, spine creases perfectly aligned. It didn't look lived in so much as maintained. She hung her coat on the hook near the door, kicked off her boots, and stood still for a moment listening. Not for anything in particular, just the silence. The kind that filled the air when there was no one waiting for you. No dog barking, no voice calling from another room. Just the low hum of the baseboard heater and the soft tick of the wall clock above the kitchenette. Her eyes drifted toward the closet. She crossed the room without turning on another light and opened the door slowly. Inside, on the top shelf, was a small, dented tin box. olive green. Military issue. The kind no one used anymore. She pulled it down gently, carried it to the table, and sat. The lid squeaked faintly as she opened it. Inside were only a few things. A purple heart, its edges slightly dulled with time. A folded American flag tightly pressed into a perfect triangle. And beneath that, a single envelope, off-white, slightly yellowed at the corners. The ink faded but legible. The name written in careful block letters. Mrs. Teresa Ruiz, El Paso, Texas. Linda picked it up, held it in both hands. The paper was soft with age, as if it had been read too many times, or maybe just held too long. The letter inside wasn't long, just a page and a half written in her sharp, slanted handwriting. An apology, a memory, a promise to visit. A line about how David had made them all laugh, even in the worst of it. A confession that she hadn't saved him when it counted. But she had never sent it, never knew how. Or maybe she'd just been afraid of what might come back. Anger, blame, or worse, nothing at all. She placed the letter back in the envelope, laid it gently inside the tin box, and closed the lid. Some things were too heavy to send. Some words never made it far beyond the battlefield. The lunch rush had thinned to a slow trickle by the time Ethan set his coffee down and approached the counter, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. Linda wasn't out front. She'd disappeared into the back after refilling his cup, her face a little tighter than usual, her shoulders drawn inward like a door beginning to close. Mr. Harper was wiping down the pie case with a stained cloth, moving in the unhurried way of a man who'd owned the same diner for most of his life. His flannel shirt was tucked half-heartedly into jeans, and a pencil rested behind one ear. When he saw Ethan approach, he offered a polite nod without pausing the rhythm of his cleaning. "Everything all right with your order?" he asked, half-focused. Ethan shook his head. "The food's fine. It's not that." Mr. Harper finally looked up. "Then what is it?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to start anything. Didn't want to disrespect a line Linda clearly didn't want crossed. But the image from that training photo, her dragging a bleeding Marine from a fire, the way she had looked directly into the chaos without blinking, refused to leave his head. "I think I know who Linda is," Ethan said quietly, "or who she used to be." Mr. Harper's eyes didn't narrow, but something in his face shifted. A subtle hardening, the kind that came from long years of keeping other people's secrets without asking for details. "She ever mentioned the Corps to you?" Ethan pressed. Mr. Harper sighed, laying the cloth across the counter like he was tired of the weight it carried. "She didn't need to. Some people wear it, whether they talk about it or not." Ethan waited. "You know she was a staff sergeant? That she saved 6 people during a mission overseas?" "She's in training manuals, sir." Harper nodded slowly. "She's good people. That's all I need to know." "But don't you think," Ethan struggled for the words, "don't you think people should know about what she did?" Mr. Harper looked at him, eyes steady. "Son, sometimes the hardest thing in the world isn't being a hero. It's walking away from it. She made peace with her silence. Maybe the rest of us ought to respect that." Ethan swallowed his argument, but the fire in him didn't dim. He nodded politely and returned to his seat, though his gaze lingered on the kitchen door. She might have walked away from her past, but it hadn't walked away from her. The bell over the door gave its usual cheerful jingle, but it was followed by something unfamiliar. Boots. Not the scuffed, mud-worn kind the locals wore, but polished, regulation black. Military issue. The kind that clicked softly on the old linoleum tiles like the sound had purpose. Linda was behind the counter, pouring a fresh cup of coffee for one of the regulars, her movements as automatic as breathing. She didn't look up at first. Why would she? People came and went. She stayed. That was the rhythm of her life. But something shifted in the air, quiet but immediate. The room didn't fall silent, not all at once, but it leaned that way. Conversations faltered. Silverware paused mid-bite. The soldiers came in slow, scanning the room with that particular blend of discipline and watchfulness. 4 of them. 2 women, 2 men, all in uniform, all with the telltale ease of those accustomed to being watched and needing not to care. They took a booth by the window, murmured among themselves. The youngest of the group, a corporal with sandy hair and a restless knee, kept glancing toward the counter. Then his eyes locked on Linda. She was walking back with the coffee pot, head slightly bowed, one hand brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. The corporal squinted, tilted his head just slightly. Recognition came not like a thunderclap, but like a slow-building echo. "Wait," he said under his breath. Then louder, "Is that—" He stopped, voice catching mid-thought, like the words were too big to say without certainty. The others turned to look. "Is that Staff Sergeant Mayfield?" The name hung in the air like smoke. Linda froze, not visibly, not the kind of freeze anyone would notice unless they were watching her closely. But Ethan, sitting at the counter, saw it. The faint hitch in her breath, the way her fingers gripped the pot just a little tighter. The coffee didn't spill, but it might as well have. Every head turned now. Even Marty leaned out from the kitchen. Linda set the pot back on the warmer. Slowly. Carefully. Then she looked up, eyes scanning the table of soldiers with the guarded calm of someone deciding whether to run or hold her ground. "I think that's her," the corporal whispered again. Linda said nothing, but her eyes, steady, steel gray, met his, and for a brief moment there was no diner. No Formica countertops or clinking silverware. Just the unmistakable stillness of someone being seen for the first time in years. And knowing there's no going back. The crash was sharp, sudden, a clatter of ceramic and silverware that shattered the low hum of diner chatter. Plates hit the floor in a messy spray of eggs, toast and broken edges, yolk bleeding across the linoleum like a slow yellow wound. Every conversation died at once. Forks paused midair, heads turned. Linda stood at the center of it, one hand still outstretched, her fingers twitching as if unsure whether to grasp or let go. Her breathing had changed, shallow, controlled, but just barely. Her other hand trembled, not dramatically, but enough that Ethan, who had been watching from his stool at the counter, knew this wasn't just about spilled dishes. He was already halfway out of his seat. She didn't say a word, didn't offer an apology or some wry remark to wave it away. Linda simply took a step back from the mess, eyes locked on the tray now lying on its side like it had been dropped from a great height, not just her hand. Marty peeked out from the kitchen, face full of concern. No one else moved. Then she turned and walked away. Not fast, not storming, just walked. Slow, measured steps toward the back hallway. The same hallway that led to the supply closet, the employee lockers, the private room where she took her 15-minute breaks in silence. Her posture never broke, but something about her seemed smaller all at once. Like a wall had cracked and the whole structure was trying not to come down with it. The door swung shut behind her with a soft click. Ethan hesitated only a second before following. Past the counter, around the corner, the other patrons watched him go, a few whispering, but no one dared to interrupt. He knocked once on the door before opening it slowly. The back room was dimly lit, a narrow bulb buzzing above a folding chair and a metal table with an old coffee can full of pens no one used. Linda stood with her back to him, facing the locker she never opened during shifts, hands gripping its edges like she needed something solid to hold on to. "I didn't mean to," Ethan started, but his voice felt too loud. Linda didn't turn around. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." For a long moment she said nothing. Then, quietly, with no force behind it at all, she said, "I used to be someone else." The words hovered in the stale air. And for the first time since he'd met her, she didn't try to take them back. The kitchen was still, save for the low rumble of the walk-in fridge and the occasional drip from the faucet that never sealed quite right. Marty had stepped out for a smoke, and the grill had been wiped clean. The burners were off. It was the only time the room ever felt calm, between lunch and dinner, when the world outside kept spinning, but the heart of the diner held its breath. Linda sat on a crate near the dry goods shelf, her elbows resting on her knees, a dish rag twisted tight in her hands. Ethan stood a few feet away, not pushing, just waiting. He had followed her not to get answers, but because something in him knew she needed to speak. She didn't look at him when she finally said it, her voice low and steady, like someone reading from a memory too well rehearsed. "I didn't want to be saluted." The words weren't angry. They weren't bitter. They just were. She let them sit there for a moment, the dish rag loosening slightly in her hands. "They tried to make me into something after the convoy," she said. "Said I was brave. Called me a hero. Put my picture on a wall at Pendleton. I couldn't walk straight yet, and they had a camera in my face." Ethan nodded slowly, saying nothing. Linda's eyes drifted down. "But I wasn't the one who kept people calm when the fire hit. That was Ruiz. David cracked a joke right before the blast, something stupid about cafeteria spaghetti. And when we were pinned, he kept talking, kept laughing. Told everyone we were going to make it out, even when I knew he didn't believe it." She paused, swallowing something too heavy for words. "I pulled him last. He was still conscious when I got to him. He said, 'Tell my mom I didn't cry.' And then he died in the evac chopper." She wiped her face quickly with the back of her hand. Not tears exactly, just the remnants of something that tried to get out. "They gave me a medal for it," she continued. "Talked about courage under fire, but the truth is, I couldn't hear a damn thing over the screaming. I just kept moving, because if I stopped, I'd think. And thinking would have gotten me killed." She looked up at Ethan then, eyes clear and unsparing. "They needed a story. Someone who survived, someone with a good headline, so I left. Changed my number. Took a job pouring coffee where nobody cared who I used to be." She shook her head softly. "David Ruiz was the hero, not me." The kitchen stayed quiet, the hum of the fridge the only sound between them. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't have to. Sometimes being seen was enough. The cemetery sat on a rise just outside of town, the kind of place people only visited on holidays or anniversaries, if at all. It was quiet there, save for the wind moving through dry grass and the rustle of old trees standing like silent sentries. No grand gates, no marble statues, just rows of modest headstones evenly spaced, names etched deep into stone that the weather couldn't quite erase. Ethan had found it by asking a librarian, of all people. Just said he was looking for a local veteran named David Ruiz, and she'd pointed the way without asking questions. Maybe she'd seen it in his eyes, whatever it was that made people need to go to places like this. He brought flowers, nothing fancy, just a small bouquet of white carnations tied with a bit of twine. He stood in front of the headstone longer than he expected to, reading the name over and over as if the letters might shift into something else. There was no grand inscription, just CPL. David Ruiz, the dates, and a line below. He made us laugh, even when we shouldn't have. Ethan told Linda about it the next day, quietly, after hours, when the diner had emptied and the world outside was dark. She didn't say much in return, just nodded once, eyes unreadable, and murmured, "Thanks for going." That night, she walked there alone. The wind had picked up, carrying the last traces of winter in its breath. She wore her oldest coat, the one with the fraying cuffs and the inside pocket where she kept things that mattered. The tin box was tucked under her arm. She found the headstone right where Ethan had said it would be. It looked smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she had grown larger in the years since. Not in height, but in the weight she carried. She knelt without ceremony, the cold seeping through her jeans, and opened the tin box. She pulled out the letter, creased and fragile from years of being almost sent, and placed it gently against the stone, tucked under the carnations Ethan had left. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she took out the ribbons. They weren't much. A Purple Heart, a few campaign medals, commendations folded neatly in velvet. She laid them down beside the letter. Then she sat there for a while, not crying, not praying, just being. The wind moved through the grass. The trees didn't speak. And Linda Mayfield, once a staff sergeant, now a waitress, finally let go of the weight she had carried for far too long. It started with a conversation in the base gym, quiet and off to the side, between sets and beneath the hum of old overhead lights. Ethan stood next to Sergeant Willis, holding a clipboard filled with names and time slots for a training rotation. But what he really wanted to talk about wasn't on any schedule. "I want to do something for her," he said. "For Mayfield." Willis didn't respond at first, just stared straight ahead at the chalkboard listing PT goals no one ever reached. Then he nodded once. "Not a parade," Ethan added. "Not some speech in front of reporters." "Good," Willis said. "She'd hate that." So they kept it simple, a folded flag. A brass plaque with her name and rank. A chair in the front row left empty, not as a slight, but as a mark of respect. Just a handful of soldiers, people who'd been through enough to know what sacrifice really looked like, standing in uniform, offering a moment of recognition for someone who never asked for it. Ethan showed up at the diner 3 days before the ceremony, hat in hand, literally. He waited until the shift change, when the place was quiet, and asked Linda if she'd come. She didn't look up from the stack of menus she was wiping. "No." "It's not about medals," he said gently. "We're not even calling it that. It's just a thank you. I don't need thanks." "I know," he said. "But maybe we do." She didn't reply, just kept cleaning, her movements a little slower than before. When he turned to leave, she said, barely above a whisper, "I don't want to be saluted." "You won't be," he promised. "You'll be seen. There's a difference." The day of the ceremony was gray and windless, the sky a heavy blanket overhead. No cameras, no podiums, just a flag, gently folded, and the sound of boots shifting quietly in gravel. Linda stood in the back. She wore her diner uniform beneath a heavy coat. No ribbons, no name tag. Her hands were in her pockets. When Ethan called her name, she stepped forward just once, accepted the plaque, nodded. No speech, just a nod. A quiet thank you for a quiet hero. And then she stepped back, blending once more into the silence. But this time she didn't hide. It started with the bell above the door, its soft jingle barely audible over the sizzle of bacon on the grill and the low murmur of regulars catching up on their weekend routines. Linda was already moving through the space like she always did on Saturdays, refilling coffee, balancing plates on one arm, offering polite nods and smiles that never reached too deep. She didn't notice the first one right away. A young woman in full uniform stepped in and quietly took a seat at the counter. She didn't speak, didn't order, just reached into her breast pocket, pulled out a small silver dog tag replica, and placed it gently on the worn laminate surface. Linda blinked, slowed just enough to register the gesture. She said nothing, simply topped off the woman's coffee and moved on, heart skipping a beat she wouldn't admit. Then came the second, and the third. By the time the fifth soldier had walked through the door, each in uniform, each solemn and wordless, something had shifted in the room. The regulars stopped talking. Forks paused halfway to mouths, and Linda stood behind the counter, coffee pot in hand, as the line of dog tags grew across the counter like quiet footprints marking a path. They didn't say her name, no grand announcement, no salutes. Each one came in, found a seat, and left a tag. Some bore initials. Others had phrases stamped into them. Semper Fi, she pulled me out. 6 men, still breathing. Each one a story, condensed into metal and silence. Marty peeked out from the kitchen, his usual sarcasm swallowed by the weight of the moment. Even Tasha, still new and uncertain, stopped mid-order and stared. No one asked questions. Linda set the coffee pot down and stood still. Her apron was the same one she wore every shift. Nothing special. A faded stain near the hem from spilled chili 3 weeks ago. But the way she stood in it now, facing this quiet formation of soldiers and unspoken reverence, it made the fabric feel like something holy. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just reached behind the counter and retrieved a small metal tin from the shelf, one of the old donation boxes. She opened the lid, carefully placed the dog tags inside, and then slid the box to the far end of the counter where sunlight hit it through the diner's front window. Then she picked up the coffee pot again. No one needed to say thank you. They already had. The chair by the window had always been there. Third booth from the left, where the sun spilled through the glass just right in the morning and cast long shadows across the checkered floor in the afternoon. It had been unremarkable for years, just another seat in a small-town diner, but lately people began to notice that it was Linda's spot. Not that she claimed it. Linda never did anything that loud. But after her shift ended, she'd take her coffee, black, 1 sugar, and slide into that booth like it was muscle memory. No book, no phone, just the coffee, the window, and whatever light the day happened to offer. And she started talking. Not much, not to everyone, but enough. One morning, a couple of regulars asked her about the photo on the diner wall, the one of the old unit that Marty had insisted they frame after the recognition ceremony. Linda chuckled, quiet and low, and said, "That was the only time we got through a week without someone losing their boots in the mud." Another time, she told a story about coffee in Kabul, how it was thick and bitter, made in dented metal pots over open flame, served in chipped mugs if you were lucky. How, once during a lull in shelling, someone had smuggled cinnamon sticks from the chow tent, and it had tasted, for just 1 minute, like Christmas. A young mechanic who usually ate in silence leaned in closer when she mentioned sandstorms. Linda talked about how the wind would howl for hours, how laughter got caught in the grit, how someone once tied goggles to a goat just to keep it from squinting. The stories weren't rehearsed or grand. They weren't offered like lessons. They just slipped out, piece by piece, like fragments she no longer needed to hide. People listened, not out of pity or spectacle, but out of something quieter. Respect, maybe. Or the deep human instinct to recognize someone who has walked through fire and come out the other side still carrying water for others. Children who used to run past her without a glance now waved shyly. Teenagers held the door open without being asked. A local teacher invited her to speak at the school's Veterans Day assembly. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. In that booth by the window, Linda Mayfield wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was seen, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself be. The plaque arrived on a Thursday morning, wrapped in brown paper and tucked under Mr. Harper's arm, like it was something delicate. He didn't say much about it at first, just came in early, coffee in hand, and stood at the wall near the front register, staring at a narrow stretch of space between the local business flyers and the old black-and-white photo of the diner's opening day. Marty watched from the kitchen pass through. Tasha peeked over the top of the dessert cooler. Neither of them said a word. They already knew. The plaque was modest, nothing flashy, nothing bold. Just brushed brass mounted on a piece of walnut, the kind of wood that held warmth even in the coldest light. Mr. Harper took his time with the installation, leveling it 3 times, tightening each screw by hand. When it was finally secured, he stepped back, read the inscription aloud once softly, as if trying it on for size, in honor of Staff Sergeant Linda Mayfield, a quiet hero who served more than just food. He didn't ask for a ribbon cutting, no newspaper, just a nod to what mattered. When Linda arrived for her shift an hour later, the diner was already busy. School kids with backpacks, farmers grabbing a quick breakfast before the feed store opened, 2 paramedics nursing a pair of oversized coffees. She slipped into her apron like always, tied it once, double-knotted the strings, and moved toward the register. Then she saw it. She didn't stop walking, but her pace slowed. Her eyes landed on the plaque, taking in the words, the way they glinted under the morning sun pouring through the windows. The brass caught just enough light to make it feel like it had always been there, like the wall had been waiting for it. She stood in front of it for a long moment. Her fingers brushed the edge, a quiet gesture that no one but Ethan noticed from across the room. "You should have asked," she said later, behind the counter as she prepped a fresh pot of coffee. Mr. Harper shrugged. "Didn't seem like the kind of thing you'd agree to." "I wouldn't have." He smiled, folded his arms. "Exactly." Linda didn't argue, didn't smile back, but as she turned to take an order, she stood just a little straighter. Not as if she needed the recognition, but as if, maybe, it had been a long time coming. The girl couldn't have been more than 15. She walked into the diner just after the morning rush, when the booths were mostly empty and the place smelled of pancakes and something faintly citrus from the freshly mopped floors. Her backpack sagged off one shoulder, weighed down not just by books, but by whatever nerves she was trying hard not to show. Linda noticed her right away. She always did with the quiet ones. The girl slid onto a stool at the counter, perched awkwardly on the edge like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to stay. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and she kept glancing toward the door like she might bolt at any second. There was a brochure sticking out of her jacket pocket, folded and creased and half-worn at the edges. Junior ROTC. Leadership, Service, Commitment. Linda poured a fresh cup of coffee and set it down gently in front of her. "Cream's to your right, sugar's behind you. First cup's on me," she said, voice soft, warm in the way only time and lived-in silence can make it. The girl blinked, surprised. "Thanks." Linda didn't press, just leaned against the counter and waited. After a long sip and an even longer pause, the girl spoke. "I've got tryouts today, for ROTC. My mom says I shouldn't bother, says I won't make it." Linda raised an eyebrow but didn't offer judgment. She just nodded once. The girl took another sip, bolder this time. "I want to try, though. I think I could be good. Maybe." Linda leaned in slightly, just enough to make sure the girl heard her. "You'll do just fine, sweetheart." It wasn't a pep talk. It wasn't loud or decorated with empty encouragement. It was something quieter, stronger, the kind of sentence that carries weight because the person saying it has already walked the road. The girl smiled, small and crooked, but real. She tucked the brochure deeper into her pocket, finished her coffee, and walked out with a bit more certainty in her step. Linda watched her go, then returned to wiping the counter. Another shift, another morning, but the moment lingered. The kindness she gave was simple. A cup of coffee, a few words. But it came from a place deeper now, etched in brass on the wall, told in dog tags in a tin, reflected in the way the town looked at her. And now it was her turn to pass it forward. Quietly, always quietly, but without hiding, not anymore.